Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode number 5 of the Bible and Science podcast. In episode 4, we started dealing with the question of does the Bible contain errors and contradictions, and went over probably a couple dozen, and we'll be doing the same thing again in this episode. Does the Bible contain errors and contradictions? The answer is no, it does not. So the first thing that so many people would say is an error is that guys like me believe there was a worldwide flood. Well, why do we believe this? Because I was cautioned by Peter, the Apostle Peter, about almost 2,000 years ago, not just me personally, but every Christian. The fisherman Peter said, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they, the scoffers, willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So Peter warned us of 3 things scoffers would say in the last days. Number 1, Jesus is not literally coming back. Where is the promise of his coming? Number 2, everything on the earth has happened at slow, steady, gradual rates. The scoffers would say, since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. So if you don't believe me that he was talking about geology, if you take a course in historical geology, they will tell you over and over, the present is the key to the past. The present is the key to the past. That is, the Earth's geologic record has built up a tiny bit at a time by little bitty processes operating over extended periods of time. So just to make sure you know he's talking about geology, Peter continues about the scoffers. This they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So Peter warned us, among other things, that scoffers would deny that there had ever been a worldwide flood. Well, I think we're in the last days. I don't know if you do, but I certainly do. So what's the basis of denying that there was ever a worldwide flood? This goes back to the late 1600s when Nicholas Steno, he formulated what he called the law of superposition. He said that number 1, sedimentary layers form one at a time, very slowly, and number 2, the ones on the bottom are always the oldest. Well, that's the basis of believing that the Earth's strata built up a tiny bit at a time, and the lowest strata are always the oldest. The problem with the law of superposition is that it's not a law. It's been falsified. In nature, Mount St. Helens gave us a beautiful example up in the state of Washington. It showed that hundreds of thousands of layers can build up in a matter of days when the volcano erupted. And in the lab, Guy Berthaud went to the Colorado School of Mines and did some well-documented experiments you can read about on YouTube. Go look for Drama in the Rocks, parts 1 through 4. And he showed that if there is a flowing current, the bottom layers may not necessarily be the oldest. Steno's law only works when there's no current. This is certainly not the case in any kind of a flood. And the law of superposition gave me a little bit of a chuckle in one of my classes one year. A student who was paying such good attention, I covered it, and then on a quiz I asked, what's the law of superposition? And one of my students said, well, some positions are so great that they're superpositions. Yeah, as you can imagine, he got a good grade in that class. Why would we not believe that there was a local flood? Well, first, Noah and the animals could have just walked away. Second, Every continent around the world has thick layers of sedimentary rock, not just the area around Mesopotamia where scoffers will say, oh, it's just a local flood in the area of Mesopotamia. Well, why wasn't Noah smart enough to walk away? But then there are seashells on top of even the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas and the Andes. I was in Peru one time teaching, and I mentioned this, and I personally had never been to the top of the Andes, but one of the young ladies raised her hand and said, yes, I've been up there. There are seashells up on the top of the Andes, which is the second highest mountain range in the world. It means that sometime in the past they were underwater. I don't think they were as high as they are now, but there was sediment accumulating because they were underwater and they had seashells. And then there are also cultures all the way around the world that have legends of a great flood that covered the entire earth. So here's a question skeptics will ask. Wow, okay, come on. If God created dinosaurs during the creation week, why didn't Noah take them on board the ark? Well, how big was the ark? Most people say, I don't know. How big were dinosaurs? Well, they were giant. Okay, let me add to that. How big were dinosaurs when they hatched from the eggs? Not all dinosaurs were large. Some were, we've never found any fossils of them larger than, say, chicken size, like Compsognathus. But then again, some of them grew to enormous size, but when they hatched from the eggs were not much bigger than a football. It would have taken them many years to grow to enormous sizes. Now, I'm of a moderate intelligence, and even with my moderate intelligence, I would know it's not a good idea to take the large dinosaurs on board my boat. God's a lot smarter than I am, and so he would not have brought the full-grown dinosaurs that would occupy a tremendous amount of space. He would have brought young dinosaurs, juvenile dinosaurs. Now, the bone structure of dinosaurs shows that they were reptiles. Since all known reptiles do better in warm climates than cold, we can logically conclude that post-flood dinosaurs would have thrived mainly in warm climates, not in cold climates. And where do we find most of the dragon legends of the world? Areas with warm climates. What's the country with the greatest number of dragon legends? China. It's also the country with the greatest number of dinosaur fossils. But as recently as within the last few decades, there have been reports of dinosaur-like creatures in remote areas of Africa. Mokele mbembe, a large thing larger than elephants. So it's possible a few dinosaurs may have made it through the flood on the ark. Well, how big was the ark? How could all those animals fit on a single boat? How big was the ark? I don't know. So you're telling me that they couldn't have fit on something you don't know the size of? I would strongly recommend, if you get a chance, to go to the replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky and just stand there and be astonished by it as I was. This uses the biblical dimensions, assuming that a cubit was about 1.5 feet. So it's about 450 by 75 by 45 feet. That's 1.5 football fields long, and wow, 75 feet wide and almost 5 stories high. So how could all the animals fit on a single boat? Well, first of all, did the water creatures have to go on board, the whales and so forth? No, it was only the land-dwelling animals that went on board. And secondly, well, how big is the average animal? Not that big. Most animals are not that large, so the average size of the animals on the ark would probably be smaller than sheep. How big was the ark? It was the largest boat ever built until the 1800s. Based upon the biblical dimensions, it had a carrying capacity of about 522 railroad boxcars. How many animals could that accommodate? A lot. It would only take about 10,000 animals, pairs of animals, 20,000 individuals, to account for every known type of living animal on the earth. Most animals are just not that big. There are not that many elephants and hippos and things like that. And if you had something that started out small, like the dinosaurs coming out of the egg, they wouldn't take up much space. So to accommodate every known living type of animal on the earth nowadays would only fill the ark up to about 1/3 of its capacity. So I reiterate, if you ever get a chance, go up to northern Kentucky to the Ark Encounter. It's an amazing thing. When you get on there, you say, this thing is so big. It's so empty. Okay, so let's look at some other things that would seem to be a weird statement in the Bible. So sometime after the flood, we had Job, whose 3 friends came to visit him. What great friends they were. And in Job chapter 37, verse 18, one of his friends, a guy named Elihu, said, hast thou with him spread out the sky, which is strong and as a molten looking glass? Well, how can you consider the sky to be strong? Well, the speaker was Elihu, not God. So even if he was wrong, the Bible is not incorrect to record men's mistakes. This happens a number of times. There was a whole group that was determined to kill Paul the Apostle, and they said, we're not even going to eat until we kill him. They couldn't get him, so I assume they started to eat again. So they were wrong, and God was correct in preserving their wrong statement. Okay, and then this verse, is the sky strong and as a molten looking glass? Is there any sense in which that could be true? Well, is the sky strong? It's not physically strong where you could stand on it, but it's strong enough to burn up almost everything that comes into the Earth's atmosphere from space, meteors, meteorites, and so forth. And then when it's translated as strong, that's not a very good translation. The Hebrew word chazak, it also conveys the sense of great in extent. Compared to us humans, is the sky great in extent? Most certainly. And then he said that it was like a molten looking glass. One of the characteristics of a molten looking glass is that it's relatively thin. If you compare the atmosphere to the size of the Earth, the atmosphere is extremely thin. From the center of the Earth to its surface is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 miles. The atmosphere only goes about another 100 and a little bit miles. So the sky is really thin as compared to the Earth. In fact, whoa, it's like a molten looking glass. Let's deal with some of the things that people say are silly, they couldn't possibly work. One of them was Lot's wife. Lot and his family were told to get out of Sodom, and the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and God had warned, don't go back there. So the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife, Lot's wife, looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Oh, okay, like a shaker full of salt, right? No, the Hebrew word translated salt is melah. It does not mean sodium chloride like you sprinkle on your French fries. It just means powder. So she turned back, and actually she tried to go back, and so she was standing there exposed, and something happened. We don't know exactly what. But if you were to instantly remove all of the moisture from a human body, that is, desiccate it, it would turn to powder. So what was left behind for Mrs. Lot? A pile of powder. So she turned into powder, which is probably a better translation than salt. Okay, here's one. You look at this and you say, oh, that's a mistake. Genesis chapter 30, verses 37 to 41. Jacob was not a biologist, but God had said, I'm going to bless this guy. God didn't care how dumb he was going to bless him anyway. So it says in Genesis chapter 30, and Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled white streaks in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. So he cuts the bark away from various kinds of things, so you'll see white streaks. And he set the rods which he had pilled before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle ring-straked and speckled and spotted. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. So Jacob was thinking, okay, if they are looking at things that have white stripes, they're going to have stripes. Well, the physical features of animals are determined not by what they see during mating, but by their DNA. Jacob didn't know anything at all about DNA, so he acted in ignorance. But he was showing God, I want this one and this one and this one. Those are the ones that I want because those are the stronger parents. So God had already determined to bless him, and he did so. Not because Jacob was such a good biologist, but in spite of Jacob's error. God prospered him because he had said, I'm going to prosper him. It wasn't Jacob's mistaken understanding of biology. It was God's determination to bless him. Okay, I'm going chronologically through the Old Testament. And if you've ever paid attention to the details about the sons of Jacob, he had 10 sons, plus he had his daughter Dinah. Well, how could Jacob's youngest son, Benjamin, have had 10 sons before he went to Egypt? This is in Genesis chapter 46. Jacob was with his father-in-law Laban for 20 years. He waited 7 years to marry Leah and Rachel, and then they started, well, at least Leah and her maids started popping out babies. So for the next 7 years, he had children with them. Jacob had just been born when his father Joseph had just been born when his father negotiated with Laban to acquire his own sheep. So for the next 6 years, Jacob's herds were growing. God had decided, I'm going to bless this guy, so he did. So Jacob was a bit older than 6 when his family left Laban. When the family was on the way to Bethel, Jacob met Esau, and then there was an incident with Shechem and so forth. And about a year after that, Rachel had her only son. It was Benjamin. I'm sorry, her second son, Benjamin. She died. While Jacob was less than 10 years old, probably closer to about 7 or so. So Benjamin was probably not more than 10 years younger than Joseph. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh in Genesis 41, he was at least 37. He was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh, so he was at least 37 before the years of famine started. Then there were 2 years of famine that he left before Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Joseph was now around 40 years old, and his brother Benjamin was not more than 10 years younger than him, so Benjamin was probably at least around 30. Was he able to have 10 sons by the age of 30? Sure. The guys around then, they would have sex with a lot of women. So Benjamin could easily have had 10 sons before his family moved to Egypt. And then later on, you'll see the lists of Benjamin's descendants among those of Jacob. Genesis 46 lists his 10 sons who entered Egypt. And then Numbers chapter 26 deals with a census 400 years later, and the Israelites were coming out of Egypt at that time. So some of the names are found there, the family of this one, this one, this one, this one. But some are missing. Ard, Naaman, Becher, Gerah, and Rosh. Where did those families go? Well, it had been almost 400 years. So Benjamin's oldest son later had 3 sons, and he named them Ard, Naaman, and Gerah. There had been 3 brothers with those names. Maybe they died, so he named three of his sons after them. This happened in my family, where somebody was named after a relative that had died, and then later on, another one was given that same name. So Becher and Rosh are not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. They may have died without leaving any male descendants. If so, their families were absorbed by other parts of the tribe of Benjamin. So, how many people went into Egypt with Jacob? Sometimes you'll see footnotes saying, oh, well, here's a problem with this, that, and that. No, you just carefully read what it says. Genesis 46:26 says, all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, that is his biological descendants, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 66. That did not include Jacob himself, and it did not include Joseph and his two sons because they were already there. They didn't come with him, they were there already. Then the next verse says, all the souls of the house of Jacob which came into Egypt were 70, that is 70. That included Jacob, Joseph, and Joseph's son. And then Acts chapter 7, verse 14, then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, threescore and 15 souls. This is 75 people. Well, wait a minute. Why are there more? Because this included the daughters-in-law who came with their husbands. Does the Bible contradict itself about how long the Israelites were in Egypt? Some people will try to say it's this many years, that many years, and so forth. It's complicated, but I hope this might shed some light onto it. God said unto Abram, this is all the way back before the Exodus and so forth. God said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And the comma is not there in Hebrew. You can't really tell. You have to go by the context. So they shall afflict them 400 years. God's talking about a 400-year period. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So God was telling Abram, your descendants are going to move out of this area, and when the Amorites have become as sinful as they ever will be, then I'll let your descendants come back. So God was saying that Abram's descendants would be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years. That time would definitely include affliction and servitude, but it didn't necessarily say they would be enslaved the whole time. The point was that for 400 years they would not own any of the land where they lived. The first of Abram's seed to become a stranger in Europe was Joseph. He was sold as a slave at about age 17, and then the rest of the family followed somewhere around 22, 23 years later. The 400 years ended, the Bible said, God told them, in the fourth generation, when Abram's descendants were to come back, quote, hither, unquote, that is, to the place where Abram was living at the time he had the vision. This was right around Hebron and Beersheba, and it was after Moses' death. So the time in Egypt had to be less than 400 years. God said Abram's descendants who were strangers in Egypt would return to Canaan in the fourth generation. Well, the first generation, Levi's son, Kohath, he was born shortly before entering Egypt, and he lived 133 years. He was never a slave. His son Amram, who was the second generation, he lived 137 years. His son Moses, who was the third generation, he lived another 80 years in Egypt and then 40 years in the wilderness. And then his sons, who were the fourth generation, Gershom and Eleazar, they were in the generation of Israelites who returned to Canaan immediately after Moses died. There were no skipped generations. They were the fourth generation. So if we add up the time Kohath, Amram, and Moses lived in Egypt, the maximum possible time, adding those years together, was no more than 350 years. So there was a 450 years, but the maximum possible time of slavery was 350. Not only that, since Kohath and Amram were probably fathering sons long before they were 130 years old, the total time was probably closer to 320 years of slavery. So that was included in the 400 years, but it was not all slavery. Slavery didn't begin until after Joseph's last brother Levi died, which was at least 90 years after the family arrived. So the slavery probably lasted less than about 230 years. Could have been a little bit more, but more like 230 years of slavery rather than 400 years of slavery. 400 years of being there, yes, but not 400 years of slavery. I know this can be pretty confusing. It took me a long time to go through it, and a lot of other people have down through the years. But I want you to realize that it all does make sense when you put it together properly. So the 400-year sojourn began when the first of Abraham's seed, that is Joseph, entered Egypt. The rest of the family came 22 years later. The sojourn ended when they returned, as the Bible says, hither, that is, to this place where the original promise was given to Abraham, to Beersheba and Hebron. This was about 7 years after they entered Canaan. So they were in Egypt for a long time. They left Egypt and they fought with the various occupants of the land, and then they eventually wound up back where Abram had been. So slavery did not begin when they first entered into Egypt. It began after the last of the previous generation died, and it ended at the Exodus. So this adds up to something less than 230 years. You can go through the chart and figure it out for yourself. And there were only 4 generations. People that try to say there were skipped generations, no, the Bible makes it plain. There were only 4 generations. So not everybody has always paid attention to this, and the translators of the Septuagint going from Hebrew into Greek, they didn't seem to completely understand. Now, I want to tell you my position. I believe the Hebrew manuscripts are correct because Jesus said heaven and earth might pass away, but one jot or one tittle, one yod or one tittle will not pass away. Well, what is a yod or a tittle? Those are the smallest Hebrew letters and the smallest vowel points of the Hebrew letters. It has nothing to do with Greek. The Septuagint was translated into Greek, and Jesus didn't say the smallest Greek thing. No, he said the smallest Hebrew letter and the smallest vowel point of a Hebrew letter will not pass away. So I believe he was confirming the inspiration and the accuracy of the Hebrew text. So the translators 1,200 years later were trying to go from the Hebrew, which a lot of people couldn't understand anymore, and they inserted some phrases that I don't think were necessary at all. In the Masoretic text, Exodus 12, verse 40 says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years." But the Septuagint translators added a phrase, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan." That was not necessary to put "and the land of Canaan." Likewise, the Samaritan Pentateuch adds another phrase, "the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt." That's not necessary either. The first one, some of the descendants of Ephraim, in 1 Chronicles chapter 7, we're told they left Egypt. They didn't stay in Egypt with the other Israelites. And so those who dwelt in Egypt was needed to clarify which Israelites were referred to. It was only the ones who stayed in Egypt, not the ones who left. And then 430 years was sufficient time for just the Israelites without having to refer to their fathers. So here are a few things that are sometimes taken as contradictions. Was Moses afraid when he left Egypt? When he was encountering some of the Jewish people in Egypt, one of them told him, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian?" And Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." Now, when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. But later on, you read in Hebrews 11, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Well, when was he afraid, or was he not afraid? It depends when. He left Egypt twice. The first time he left on his own, fleeing for his life, he was afraid. The second time in Hebrews 11, he was leaving at God's instructions and he had no fear. Is this a contradiction? You'll see different wording in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 versus in Deuteronomy 5. Exodus 20 is a word-for-word reading of what was written on the tablets. But then many years later, Deuteronomy 5 is a record of Moses preaching. He was reiterating and explaining what God said to a new generation 40 years later. Well, when my pastor preaches, sometimes he throws in extra words. Does yours? Yes, of course, when you're doing explanations. So Exodus 20 was a literal word-for-word reading. Deuteronomy chapter 5 was preaching. It was explaining and adding things for understanding. Does the Bible contradict itself on capital punishment? Sometimes you'll see yard signs in people's yards that say, "Thou shalt not kill." That's not actually what the Bible says. Kill is not the best translation. There's another word, murder, which means to kill without just cause. That's what the Bible is talking about. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 really should say, "Thou shalt not murder," and quite a number of translations do say that. Murder is killing without cause. There are times when there is killing with cause. In fact, the law of Moses requires the society to apply the death penalty to somebody for certain offenses. Is that a contradiction? No. The word translated killed is rasa, but it really would be well translated or better translated as murder. You shall not kill without just cause. And then notice in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, it says, "Thou shalt not kill." One of the nice things about the King James Version is it used thou for singular and you or ye for plural. In Exodus chapter 20, it's referring to individuals. It says, "You, the individual, thou, you shall not murder." But it doesn't mean that the society cannot take a life in punishment for crimes. In fact, society was required to. The times when society, or the city at least, was required to, was in punishment for certain designated crimes, but only after due process had been exhausted. Everybody had a trial before the elders of the city. They didn't have to go to law school, but they had to be elders of the city. And then you were allowed to kill in defense of yourself or your family or someone else that you were responsible for the life and safety of. And then you were allowed to kill in times of war, for instance, when you're defending your nation. Killing was definitely allowed, and in fact, in certain circumstances, it was required. Murder was never allowed, but killing sometimes was. Here's another thing. Does the Bible contradict itself about the Sabbath? If you noticed, most Christian churches worship on Sunday, but the Jewish people worshiped on Saturday, the Shabbat, the Sabbath. Does the Bible contradict itself? Why don't we worship on Saturday? Well, the Bible doesn't mention the Sabbath anywhere in Genesis. Did you know that? The first time Sabbath is mentioned is in Exodus chapter 18, verses 23 to 29. God established the Sabbath for the Israelites. It was part of the law. It was a new concept to them. It became mandatory first in the Ten Commandments. In Exodus chapter 20, you read it, and Nehemiah reiterates that's when the Sabbath was brought in, at the time of the Ten Commandments. So those who try to establish their own righteousness by living under this part of the law are obligated to keep the whole law, over 600 commandments, it tells us in Galatians chapter 3. If you decided to be just by the law, you have to keep the whole law. Christians are not in bondage to observe any specific day of rest. We certainly should. We should worship God as he reveals to us. So this is what Paul wrote in Romans. One man, and remember, Paul was a Pharisee. He was a member of the strictest sect of the Jewish religion. Paul wrote, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. And Paul said, regarding the Sabbath rest, we believers have already entered into our rest. So we'll continue on in the next episode of the Bible and Science. I hope this has done you some good, and there are still several dozen alleged contradictions to come in the next episode, so I hope you enjoy it.